The glass exploded inward, and the rain came with it. I felt the cold spray across my face before I saw the shape scrambling through the broken window of the sporting goods store, a thing of jerky movements and wet, ragged cloth. It was a park ranger, or it had been, because the tatters of the uniform were still there, the green fabric dark with grime, and something else. I remembered a day trip to Crater Lake with Hein and Chi years ago, before the world went quiet, then started screaming. A ranger had shown Chi a pine cone, explaining how the seeds worked, and Hein had smiled a certain way, a way that made me feel like the bridge I was designing back in Eugene was the most important structure on Earth. The memory was a physical pain, a sharp stone in my gut. That first day, the day Hein came home from the lab with a fever she couldn't explain, the air itself had felt wrong. It was a pressure change, the kind you feel before a bad storm, but it never broke. The news talked about a flu, then a riot, then the screens went black. The sounds were what I remembered most. The sirens that blended into one long note held for 3 days, then the silence that followed, which was worse. Then came the new sounds, the low collective vibration from the streets, the wet tearing noises from next door. I had to lock our own door. I had to look at Hein as her eyes clouded over and her breathing hitched into a new rhythm, and I had to make a choice that broke the last intact thing inside me. Chie saw it all from the doorway of her room, her face a pale oval in the gloom. She hadn't spoken a word since. The thing in the ranger uniform was halfway inside now, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. My rifle was already up, the worn stock pressed against my shoulder, but my hands were shaking. We hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the weakness was a hollow ache in my bones. I had 5 bullets left. 5 chances to keep Chie safe, to pay the debt I owed Hein. 1 for this creature, maybe 2 for the horde outside if they followed, and then what? I centered the iron sights on its head, my finger tightening on the trigger, the cold metal a familiar and terrible comfort. Before I could fire, Chie moved. She was sitting against the far wall, a small shape wrapped in the bright yellow raincoat her mother had bought for her, the one thing I made sure she never outgrew. She did not turn around or make a sound. She just raised her right hand, her small palm facing the wall, a quiet, simple gesture. The deep, resonant vibration from the 24 infected outside, a constant pressure against the building for 48 hours, just stopped. The silence that rushed in was so total it felt like a blow. The ranger inside the store froze, its crawl stuttering to a halt. It tilted its head, listening to a sound I could not hear, and then it slowly, deliberately, backed out of the window and was swallowed by the rain. I stared at the empty space, my rifle still raised. My mind, the engineer's mind that saw stress points and load-bearing truths, tried to build a logical framework for what had just happened. It was a fluke. The horde was moving on. The creature was distracted. Any explanation was better than the one staring at me from the back of my daughter's small, still form. I lowered the rifle, the barrel suddenly heavy as stone, and went to her. I knelt down and pulled her into my arms, her body thin and fragile against my chest. Her survival was the only system I had left to control, and I felt it slipping through my fingers. The silence held, a thick and unnerving blanket over the world. I watched her, really watched her, as she slept fitfully an hour later. Her face was pale, her dark hair stuck to her forehead. I had always seen her silence as a wound, a trauma I had inflicted upon her. I had treated her like a fragile piece of glass, shielding her from a world I had failed to keep in order. Now, a new and cold possibility took root in my mind. Maybe she wasn't hiding from the world. Maybe she was listening to it. We couldn't stay. The last can of beans was gone, and the snows would soon make the mountain passes impossible to cross. There were whispers among other wanderers of a place south, a fortified rail yard in Klamath Falls called the Junction. They had walls, food, and rules. It was a long shot, a gamble against hunger and the things that roamed the broken highways. But staying here was a slow, certain death. I packed our few belongings into my worn canvas bag, my movements quiet and deliberate. I avoided looking at Chia, afraid of what I might see in her large, dark eyes. When everything was ready, I nudged her shoulder gently. "Let's go, Chie." She looked up at me, her gaze steady, and for the first time in 2 years, she spoke. Her voice was a tiny, unused thing, a thread of sound in the vast quiet. "They're waiting." I ignored the chill that went down my spine and helped her to her feet, pretending she meant the infected, that she was just afraid. We slipped out the back door and into the dripping green wilderness that was eating the edges of the town. The highway was a gray, cracked spine overgrown with weeds. We followed it south for a day, the skeleton of a burned-out city bus marking our progress. We found a gas station off a side road, its windows shattered and its pumps stripped. I saw fresh tire tracks in the mud near the entrance, a sign that someone else used this route, which made my hand rest on the pistol at my hip. I left Chie hidden in a ditch and went inside, my feet crunching on broken glass. There was one of them inside, trapped in a back room, and I had to use my pistol. The shot was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed out across the empty valley, a dinner bell for anything within miles. I grabbed a dusty box of crackers and a plastic jug of water and ran back to Chiai. We had to move, now. But it was too late. A truck, a big one with metal plates welded to its sides, crested the hill and came barreling down the road toward us. It wasn't military. It was something cobbled together from scrap and desperation. It skidded to a stop 20 yards away, and 2 men got out, carrying rifles with an easy confidence that spoke of practice. They were from the junction. We were caught. There was nowhere to run. The lead scout, a man with a hard face and watchful eyes, walked toward us. His gaze passed over me and settled on Chie. He scanned the silent trees around us, his brow furrowed. The gunshot should have brought a dozen of them down on us, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the dripping water from the trees. He didn't raise his rifle. He raised a small radio to his lips. "Veche, you need to see this. The gunshot, there's no echo." The scout laid out the choice with a calm, reasonable voice that made it all the more threatening. We could go with them to the junction where there was food and shelter and walls high enough to keep the night out. Or we could stay here, where they had just announced our location to anyone with a radio. My entire being screamed to run, to take our chances in the woods I knew how to navigate, to trust no one but myself. That was the first rule. The living are more dangerous. Then I looked at Chie. She was shivering, her face bloodless. Her eyes were hollowed out by a hunger I couldn't fix. As I watched, I saw her lift the sleeve of her jacket to her mouth, her small teeth trying to find purchase on the worn edge of the leather cuff. The sight broke something in me. My failure wasn't just in the past. It was here, right now, watching my daughter try to eat her own clothes. All my systems, all my planning, had led to this. I let out a long breath and my shoulders slumped. I slowly bent down and placed my rifle on the muddy ground. The lead scout smirked. Wise choice. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on my daughter. "Now, about the girl." I nodded, a gesture of complete surrender. I helped Chie take a step toward the truck, but her legs buckled. She collapsed in a heap, her small body finally giving out. I lunged for her, but one of the men put a firm hand on my chest, stopping me. They picked her up, her yellow raincoat a splash of color against the gray world, and carried her limp form to the back of the truck. I followed, my feet feeling like lead. I had traded one cage for another, the known danger of the wilderness for the unknown intentions of men. They laid Chi down on the cold metal floor of the truck bed, and I climbed in after her, sitting in the darkness beside her. The heavy metal gate swung shut behind me, sealing us in. Then I heard the final sound, the cold metallic click of the lock sliding into place from the outside. The man with the shaved head stood before a stack of fuel barrels, and his voice was as hard as the gravel under our feet. "We hunt the demons that wear the faces of children." I pulled Chia tighter against my leg, her small body shielded by the shadow of a rusted freight car. The man was large, his tactical vest adorned with a single carved pine cone that swayed when he spoke. He was one of them, the Purifier's coupe had founded, but he called his unit the Shepherds. He and his 5 soldiers faced Veche and her guards in the open yard, the space between them charged with a dangerous stillness. The deal was for ammunition, a trade for the fuel. the junction siphoned from abandoned tanks along the rail line. "We have no demons here, Shepherd," Vetcha replied, her arms crossed over her chest. She stood with her weight on one foot, a picture of casual authority that fooled no one. "Just people trying to survive." "You shelter ignorance," the shepherd said, his voice rising with conviction. "You think the horde is mindless, a force of nature. It is not. It is an army, and it has generals. They are called vessels, and we have a better name for them. Lures." The word landed in my gut like a stone. I felt Chie's hand find mine, her fingers cool and small. I looked down, but her face was hidden by the hood of her yellow jacket. For 2 years I had run from what I saw, from the memory of the infected ranger who turned back, from every other time the chime had swerved around us like water around a rock. I had called it luck. This man was giving it a name. "These lures," the shepherd continued, his gaze sweeping over the silent junction workers who watched from the periphery. "They draw the infected. They stand in the storm and are not consumed. They are the rot at the core of the plague." Vetcha just watched him, her expression unreadable. She was a pragmatist, a woman who measured everything in units of use. Ideology was a waste of calories to her. "What you believe is your business," Vetcha said. "My business is 10,000 rounds of rifle ammunition for 200 gallons of diesel. Is that a deal we can make?" Before the shepherd could answer, a man near the gate made a choked sound and fell to the ground. His body went rigid, then began to jerk violently, his limbs thrashing against the hard-packed earth. It was a seizure, a common enough sight in a world of bad food and constant stress. It should have meant nothing, but the air changed. From miles away, beyond the high container walls, the deep, resonant tone of the collective began to swell. It was a sound I felt in my teeth, a low vibration that signaled agitation, the sound that always came before a charge. The junction guards raised their rifles, their eyes scanning the tops of the fences. The shepherds did the same, forming a tight circle. But Vetcha did not move. Her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. I saw her sharp eyes flick towards the man on the ground, then toward the distant, unseen horde whose call was growing stronger, and then her gaze settled on Chea. My daughter stood perfectly still beside me. Her hand was in mine. Her body was small, but she was not cowering. She was just present, a point of absolute calm in the rising panic. Vetch's eyes narrowed. She saw the twitching man, she heard the distant call, and she saw my silent child. Then she looked at the razor wire on the nearby fence line where a dozen local echoes were perched, their bodies still and passive, utterly ignoring the seizure and the growing noise from their own kind. The world shifted. I saw the calculation click into place behind Vetch's eyes. This zealous story about a lure, the strange child who never spoke, the unnatural behavior of the horde. She connected it all. A thin smile touched her lips, a look of pure, cold discovery. The man on the ground finally went limp, and the distant sound receded slowly, the crisis passing as quickly as it had arrived. I had to get Chie out of her sight. I began to back away slowly, pulling Chi with me, melting into the deeper shadows between 2 stacks of shipping containers. I thought we were clear, just another pair of refugees fading into the background. I stopped to catch my breath in the narrow, dark space, the smell of rust thick in the air. Vetcha was walking back towards the main warehouse, her second in command at her side. They passed the opening of my hiding spot and I froze. "Forget Coupe's ammunition," Vetcha said, her voice low and clear in the sudden quiet. "A lure that can pacify the horde. Find out what the shepherds would pay for that, and then double it." I grabbed Chie's hand and ran. There was no plan, only the cold certainty that Vetcha's words were a death sentence wrapped in a business proposal. We darted through the narrow canyon between shipping containers, the smell of rust and old rain filling my lungs. The exit was 100 yards away across an open yard. We would never make it. 2 of Vetcha's guards stepped out from behind a stack of rotting pallets, their rifles held low. They did not shout, they just blocked the way. They put me in a freight container with rusted holes in the ceiling that let in slivers of gray light. The heavy door slammed shut, and the bolt slid into place with a sound of finality. Through a gap in the doors, I saw them lead Chi away. Her small form in the oversized yellow jacket grew smaller, a bright spot of color against the grim metal of the junction, until she disappeared into the main warehouse. The chime had been a constant low-frequency sound for days, a backdrop to our lives, but now the collective tone began to rise. It swelled from a distant vibration into a sound that pressed on my skull, a signal of distress that I knew was coming from my daughter. The gunfire started 10 minutes later. It was sporadic at first, then it became a sustained roar of automatic weapons mixed with the screams of the dying. The container shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. I threw my shoulder against the door, again and again, but the steel would not yield. Through the gap I saw them, a flood of echoes pouring over the walls, moving with a fluid purpose that I had never seen before. They were not shambling, they were running. They ignored the panicked workers and focused on the guards and the shepherds, tearing them apart with a coordinated savagery. Vechi's fortress was being dismantled. A ragged shape in a torn security uniform appeared in the gap, its face a ruin of fungal growth. It did not try to get to me. It simply pulled at the heavy bolt on the door. Metal screeched and groaned until the lock broke. The door swung open, and the echo turned and melted back into the chaos. I was free. I ran towards the warehouse, my axe in my hand, fighting through the wreckage of Veche's small empire. The dead were everywhere, a carpet of pragmatists and ideologues alike. The chimes swarmed around me, but they parted like a river around a stone, their attention fixed elsewhere. I found Xie in Veche's office. The woman who ran the junction lay on the floor near her desk, her throat opened wide. My daughter stood by the window, looking out at the slaughter. A dozen echoes were in the room with her, standing perfectly still like statues, a silent honor guard. I walked to her slowly, my heart a hammer against my ribs. I knelt beside her and put my hands on her shoulders. She was trembling. Her fear was a broadcast, and the horde outside was its violent expression. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight against my chest. I whispered to her, telling her it was okay, that I was here, that she was safe. Her trembling subsided, and as she calmed, the frenzy outside began to fade. The screams died down. The chime's movements became slower, less aggressive. They were no longer a mindless mob. They were an army awaiting orders. In the ruin of the junction, surrounded by the quiet dead, I finally understood. I had spent 2 years running, trying to hide her from a world I thought was hostile. But the world wasn't just hostile. It had changed its fundamental rules. Coupe and his shepherds would never stop. They would hunt her, and men like them would rise everywhere, their fear giving them a righteous cause. There was no hiding place, no sanctuary we could find. The only way to keep her safe was to make a sanctuary. We had to extinguish the idea that she was a demon to be hunted. We had to go to the source. We walked out of the fallen compound, and the chime followed. They fell into a silent, shuffling column behind us, a tide of broken bodies bound to my daughter's will. We traveled south for days, the horde our shadow. Snow began to fall as we climbed into the mountains, thick flakes that muffled the sound of our passage. I stopped and unfolded my worn map on a frozen rock. The peak of Mount Shasta was a stark outline against the gray sky. I looked at Chie. Her face was calm, her dark eyes holding a new, solemn weight. "Are you ready?" I asked. She looked at the mountain, then back at me, and gave a single slow nod. The siege of Coupe's lodge was short and brutal. His high fences and trained soldiers were built to fight men, not an avalanche of bodies directed by a single silent mind. The shepherds fought with the conviction of true believers, holding the line until they were overwhelmed, convinced they were dying to save the world from the small girl in the yellow jacket who watched from a nearby ridge. In the final chaotic moments of the battle, I saw Coupe cornered near the geothermal power station at the heart of his fortress. A few of his men remained, including a young shepherd named Elias, whose military gear looked too big for him. As the chime closed in, their numbers unstoppable, Coupe did not make a final stand. He grabbed Elias by the tactical vest and shoved the boy forward into the press of infected bodies. "For the cause!" Coupe shouted. The chime fell on the boy. and in that moment of distraction, Coupe broke free. He ran for the power station, saw Che standing near me, and snatched her. He dragged her inside the industrial building before I could reach them. I found him on a narrow catwalk high above the roaring turbines. He held Chie in front of him, a knife to her throat. The noise was immense, the air thick with steam and the smell of ozone. "She's a demon," he screamed over the machinery, his face a mask of crazed certainty. "An abomination that must be destroyed to save us." I took a step forward, my hands empty. I was done with denial, done with fighting the truth of what she was. "The world you wanted to save is already gone," I said, and my voice was calm. It was the last piece of the old Jivek, the man who believed in systems and control, falling away. He dragged Chie backward toward a heavy steel door at the end of the catwalk. He slammed it shut between us, and I heard the bolt slide home. Through the door's small, reinforced window, I saw Chie look at me. Her expression was not one of fear. It was a look of pure, focused command. She had seen my face, heard my words, and knew I had finally, completely accepted her. She closed her eyes. The lights in the power station flickered once, then died. The deafening roar of the turbines whined down into an oppressive silence. Outside, the horde had received her command and were physically tearing the power lines from the mountain. The sudden darkness was absolute. I found a loose steel pipe on the catwalk railing and smashed it against the window and the door until it shattered. I reached through, found the bolt, and slid it open. I attacked Coupe in the dark. He was stronger, but I knew the layout of this place. I had studied the plans I scavenged weeks ago. I knew every support beam, every trip hazard. I disoriented him, forcing him backward step by step on the narrow walkway, our grunts and the scuffle of our boots, the only sounds in the dead station. I put all my weight into one final shove, and he stumbled back into the shadows at the end of the catwalk. I expected to hear him scream as he fell. Instead, there was a low, wet gurgle and the sound of tearing flesh. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Elias, the young shepherd Coupe had sacrificed. His uniform was torn, his face a gray mask of infection, but he moved with a deliberate purpose. He had been waiting. I took Chie's hand and led her outside onto the catwalk. The blizzard that had raged during the battle was breaking. Below us, the valley was blanketed in fresh snow. It was filled with thousands of echoes, a silent army standing motionless in the clearing dawn. Every single one of them had their head turned up, watching my daughter. I placed my hand on her shoulder. The gesture was different now. I was not shielding a fragile girl from the world. I was standing beside a queen. The traumatized child was gone. In her place was a silent monarch, and I was her first and most devoted subject.